Hello, welcome to PCAP's Native Prairie Speaker Series. My name is Caitlin Rose-Seiler, and I am the Stewardship Coordinator with Saskatchewan Prairie Conservation Action Plan, or PCAP. Today, Phil Rose will be speaking about conservation of sage-grouse, critical habitat, and implications for prairie songbirds. I'd like to start by stating we respectfully acknowledge that we are on the traditional territories of many Indigenous nations and communities, past and present. For millennia, they have worked to protect these landscapes and the life these areas sustain. I would like to thank these original caretakers and acknowledge the ongoing work and presence of Indigenous peoples in Canada today. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we begin. PCAP's Native Prairie Speaker Series is a monthly presentation, either in the form of a webinar or an in-person talk. It has anything to do with Native Prairie conservation or species at risk. And we have an awesome lineup of speakers coming up. So on June 8th, Corey Olson from the Alberta Community Bat Program will be talking about bats. PCAP will be hosting our annual Native Prairie Appreciation Week from June 14th to 18th, and there will be a series of webinars there about native prairie gardening, and you can register for these webinars through the PCAP website. All past presentations can be found on the PCAP YouTube channel, and this webinar will be uploaded there in the near future. I'd like to take a moment to note that financial support for today's webinar is provided by our presenting sponsors, Eco-Friendly Sask, Saskatchewan Cattlemen's Association, Sask Energy, SaskTal, and Wildlife Habitat Canada. Our supporting sponsors are Camp Wilfillow, as well as Environment and Climate Change Canada. And a reminder to all of our listeners out there, if you have any questions during the presentation, please feel free to type it into the questions section of the webinar dashboard at any time during the presentation. If you're on a cell phone, you can send your question by chat to the organizer, and questions will be answered at the end of the webinar. Now, a bit about today's presenter. Phil is a wildlife biologist from Southwest Manitoba and completed his master's degree at the University of Regina on grassland songbirds. The topic of his thesis was developing habitat management targets for species at risk that could be achieved on native rangelands through ranching and grazing. Phil has also worked for the Native Plant Solutions Division of Ducks Unlimited Canada on wetland and native grassland restoration projects. For the last 3 years, Phil has worked for the Alberta Conservation Association on the Multi-SAR program, collaborating with ranchers to develop habitat plans for species at risk on their properties. His job entails surveying for species at risk, as well as providing ranchers with information and funding for habitat enhancement projects. So with that, I'd like to pass it over to Phil.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Caitlin. I'll just share my screen right now. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for tuning into my talk. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about a portion of my master's research that was completed a couple years back, and which will be published in the Wildlife Society Bulletin later this year. So this project could not have been possible without my co-authors and former supervisors, Dr. Stephen Davis from Environment and Climate Change Canada, as well as Dr. Mark Brigham from the University of Regina. So the objectives of our study were to examine habitat selection of grassland songbirds within sage-grouse critical habitat, and at the same time gain a better understanding of how the protection of this area will benefit additional prairie species. So in a sense, we want to examine whether sage-grouse could serve as an umbrella species for grassland songbirds at the northern extent of its range. So here's a bit of an outline of what my presentation will cover today. First, I'll provide a brief introduction on the umbrella species concept, and then give an overview of greater sage-grouse and grassland songbirds. Next, I'll briefly discuss our study area and design, which will be followed by our results. And then finally, I'll conclude with some potential management implications. So the umbrella species approach is based on the assumption that the strategic protection of one or more umbrella species will provide a protective umbrella for co-occurring species in that same area. It's meant to maximize conservation efforts in situations where there are limited resources available for research and management. So umbrella species that have been proposed over the years often share many similar characteristics. First of all, they're often well-studied species. So it's hard to predict the impact that conservation of one species will have on others if you know little about factors such as the habitat it selects or the threats it faces. So a species like the spotted owl from the western US is a good example of a well-studied species at risk that has been proposed as an umbrella species. The effects of timber harvest have been well documented on this owl, and research has been conducted down to individual pairs throughout much of its range. However, the Eskimo curlew likely would have made a very poor umbrella species. Before it was presumed to have gone extinct, little was known about this species, and nobody could even find where its breeding area was. Another commonality of the umbrella species concept is that they often occupy extensive territories or geographic ranges. So the larger the area required to sustain a species, the more likely it is to overlap with other species that could benefit from its conservation. So one highly touted umbrella species is the grizzly bear, which requires not only large areas to sustain just a single individual, but also massive areas to sustain viable populations. In contrast, species that are unique to very small isolated areas would offer protection to relatively few species. For example, the Banff spring snail is restricted only to a few hot springs in Banff National Park. So based on this criteria, it definitely would make a very poor candidate as an umbrella species. Umbrella species also tend to be sensitive to human disturbance. So protecting a species at the high end of the sensitivity range can have positive effects on other species that are equally or less sensitive, whereas protecting species tolerant of human disturbance would not. So caribou residing in the boreal forest happen to be very sensitive to development and habitat fragmentation. So mitigating fragmentation and disturbance to conserve caribou also benefits other boreal species sensitive to these same threats. On the other hand, species like the American crow do quite well under a variety of natural and human influence conditions. Therefore, if you were to begin a Promote the Crow campaign, this likely would have very little impact on conservation as a whole. Lastly, one hotly contested common characteristic of the umbrella species is that they are charismatic or appealing to the general public. So it's much easier to get support for adorable species like the sea otter than other perhaps slightly less attractive species like the wolffish shown here. So the umbrella species concept certainly is not without its own critiques and opposition from conservationists. Many feel that it lacks scientific merit and instead of selecting species based on defendable criteria, too much emphasis is placed on superficial criteria such as its appeal to the public. Also, some studies have shown that establishing protected areas based on the umbrella species concept can largely miss some of those biodiversity hotspots. Even worse, other studies have shown that establishing protected areas based on random sites could be equally as effective as the umbrella species concept. Lastly, if we're selecting umbrella species based on their large geographic ranges or territories, then why not just focus on landscape level conservation instead, which is essentially similar. So now that you've heard a little of the good, the bad, and the ugly of the umbrella species concept, is it even a viable approach to conservation? Or perhaps did I just waste 2 years of research for nothing? Well, I might be a little biased, but I do believe there is still utility in umbrella species. So people are often quick to label something a failure if it doesn't provide solutions to every problem. And the umbrella species approach certainly doesn't fix everything, but perhaps can be one important tool in a range of options that we use. So conservation would be a whole lot simpler if we had all the information available to us, but we're still faced with knowledge gaps and a lack of resources to study each species equally and make the most informed decisions. Umbrella species can help maximize conservation in this scenario, but what's really important is that we remain adaptable and make changes as new information becomes available. So single species approaches to conservation might be riskier in other regions like the tropics, where biodiversity is much greater, but in temperate regions like where we exist, protecting biodiversity at a large scale is often best achieved by preventing some of the rarest and most sensitive species from disappearing. So why not examine the possibility of species at risk as umbrella species and determine if management already being directed towards them anyway can also benefit other co-occurring species in that area. And also a lot of umbrella species research and criticism has been focused on creating protected areas. But in truth, we must keep in mind that conservation extends well beyond the borders of these areas. And in reality, they only consist of a small proportion of the landscape. And it's also unrealistic to expect that the conservation or management directed towards a single species will offer complete protection to all species in that region. So for this reason, a multiple umbrella species approach is more widely accepted. One North American species that has received considerable attention as a potential umbrella species is the greater sage-grouse. So in Canada, the species is listed as federally endangered and is one of the highest conservation priorities. Also in Canada, the sage-grouse geographic range has been reduced to 7% of its original extent, and populations have declined by 82 to 92% over the last 2 decades. So in order to address this, critical habitat for the species has been completely identified and mapped out. And when I say critical habitat, what I'm referring to is the habitat necessary for the long-term survival or recovery of the species. And this includes regions where habitat is currently required, as well as historically important areas. So the greater sage-grouse checks off a lot of the boxes for common attributes of an umbrella species. Viable populations require large areas, they're well studied and sensitive to human disturbance, and because of their appearance and breeding behavior, they're charismatic to the general public. Furthermore, because of declining populations, they remain likely to receive intensive management. Because they're federally listed as an endangered species, they require a recovery strategy, which maps out a path to return sage-grouse numbers back to an acceptable level. So recovery strategies contain valuable information about species status, general biology, threats to persistence, their critical habitat requirements, as well as their overall conservation approach. Another important section of the recovery strategy contains information on how sage-grouse conservation will affect other species and whether this effect is positive or negative. And this naturally provides some of the built-in information necessary for the umbrella species concept. However, unfortunately, much of this information is also lacking. So the potential of sage-grouse to serve as an umbrella species for other sagebrush species at the core of its range has been well documented and extensively studied. So some of these sagebrush species include sage thrasher, brewer's sparrow, sagebrush sparrow, pygmy rabbit, and sagebrush lizard. And many of these species are also conservation priorities in these sagebrush areas. So the overlap in habitat use between sage-grouse and these other species depends on the scale at which you perceive the habitat at. So for example, sage-grouse and sagebrush lizards might have very different habitat niches or very different habitat requirements within the sagebrush ecosystem. But broader high-level conservation of these areas to protect sage-grouse is likely also to encompass some of those smaller microsites required by the sagebrush lizard. One of the reasons why sage-grouse conservation can benefit so many other species is due to the fact that sage-grouse require many different habitat conditions with varying densities of sagebrush to fulfill their seasonal requirements. Sage-grouse may use thicker areas of sagebrush for nesting or as a winter food source, and relatively open patches with high forb cover for brood rearing. So there are obvious benefits of sage-grouse conservation for other sagebrush species, and that connection is quite clear. But how does sage-grouse management affect grassland songbirds? Again, this sort of relates back to that recovery strategy section I just mentioned about what is its effect on other species. Could there even be a possibility that grassland songbirds fall under the sage-grouse umbrella? This seems unlikely, as many grassland songbirds are adapted to wide open prairie, and many of the native grass specialists have a very low tolerance to shrubs like sagebrush. But keep in mind, sage-grouse do require a mosaic of habitat patches, and some of these more open areas could potentially be large enough to support at least part of the grassland songbird community. Also, sagebrush at the northern extent of the sage-grouse geographic range is much sparser as it transitions into open prairie, and it's dominated largely by silver sagebrush, which is shorter and less robust in comparison to big sagebrush, which dominates a lot of the core sage-grouse country in the United States. So this could have very important implications, as the outlook for grassland songbirds is also quite troubling. So out of 28 songbirds that are considered to be dependent on these grassland areas, 60% have experienced population declines from 2005 to 2015. And 25% of these species are in significant decline. So in fact, grassland birds are experiencing the most declines compared to bird species of any other habitat type. As a result, 6 grassland songbird species at risk do have breeding ranges that overlap with sage-grouse critical habitat here in Canada. So this includes Sprague's pipit, chestnut-collared longspur, thick-billed longspur, lark bunting, bobolink, And all of these species are classified as threatened, which is one level below endangered, like the greater sage-grouse. It also includes Baird sparrow, which is classified as special concern, which is one other level below that. So the main reason for much of the grassland songbird declines is the result of widespread habitat loss and degradation. In fact, many of the species at risk used to be quite plentiful across the prairies before European settlement. However, the light green areas shown on the slide here represent what now remains of our grassland here in Canada. So as you can see, other than a few large areas in Alberta and southwestern Saskatchewan, most of our grasslands have been lost. And what they've mostly been lost to is cropland, which are the white areas on the map there. And once you lose these areas, you also lose the grassland birds that used to occupy them. So Alberta is in the best shape with 43% of its grassland area remaining, Saskatchewan with 22%, and Manitoba with as little as 18%. Also keeping in mind that this doesn't necessarily reflect the amount of unplowed native grassland remaining, which is even more rare. So the main cause of grassland habitat loss is due to cultivation, but it's also indirectly lost by encroachment of trees and shrubs, the spread of exotic plant species like leafy spurge, downy and Japanese brome, and crested wheatgrass, as well as rangeland degradation caused by continued overexploitation of range resources. What complicates things even more is that grassland birds don't just require grass. Each species responds differently to gradients in vegetation structure, which are created by environmental factors like moisture, as well as grazing, and each species has their own unique requirements. So you can kind of see that on the slide here, where each species is given a bar, and that kind of overlaps at the bottom with what types of vegetation structure that species prefers. So some species prefer tall, dense grass created under light to moderate grazing regimes. So an example of a species like that is the sedge wren, while others prefer short, sparse grasslands created by higher intensity grazing. Even more so, others require habitat features such as trees, shrubs, shorelines, and wetlands. So therefore, management directed towards one species could ultimately have negative effects on several other species at the same time. On the positive side, there is a lot of overlap between the vegetation requirements of many of these grassland songbirds. So this can provide opportunities to apply multi-species conservation plans, similar to the South of the Divide action plan that's already being implemented in the Milk River drainage area of southwestern Saskatchewan. So these action plans don't need to encompass every single species, but might focus on a select number of focal species, very similar to the umbrella species concept. And so after taking you down a very long winding road, this slowly brings us back full circle to my research objectives. So based on our research objectives, we took the more pessimistic approach and accepted kind of the easy hypothesis that sage-grouse critical habitat is less suitable for these grassland specialist songbirds. And we felt this way because of the presence of silver sagebrush and other shrubs in the area. But on the other hand, we felt that it would be an important area for grassland generalists and other species that have broader habitat preferences. So we predicted that the abundance of grassland specialists would be lower in sage-grouse critical habitat in comparison to the surrounding area. And it would also be negatively influenced by sagebrush and other shrubs. On the other hand, the abundance of grassland generalists would be equal or greater in sage-grouse critical habitat and would have a positive or neutral association with shrubs. So this slide shows a map of our study area in southwestern Saskatchewan. It was enclosed entirely within the South of the Divide region, and these dark gray areas show the location of sage-grouse critical habitat. Also, the various types of cross-thatching show locations of community pastures, such as former PFRA pastures and former provincial community pastures, as well as protected areas such as Grasslands National Park and Nature Conservancy of Canada properties. So all of these areas were important study sites for our project. Plus, we had several private grazing co-ops and landowners that were also gracious enough to allow us on their property. So our study sites were spread out throughout sage-grouse critical habitat, which is represented here by the colored areas. We also sampled sites within a 1 mile or 1.6 kilometer buffer area surrounding sage-grouse critical habitat, which is shown here in the light blue areas around those critical habitat spots. We chose a 1 mile buffer for comparison because these areas were far enough from core sage-grouse habitat that they were not deemed critical habitat by the federal government, and they were more likely to be transition zones between sagebrush and prairie habitats. But on the other hand, they were also close enough to sagebrush critical habitat that they were influenced by the same climate, soil, and land use factors. So we also stratified sagebrush critical habitat in the buffer area based on sagebrush density, which was obtained from the 2002 Saskatchewan Sagebrush Inventory. So that's what the different colors of sagebrush critical habitat on this slide represent. So high, medium, and low densities of sagebrush. And those are kind of the reddish colors, the orange colors, and the yellowish colors there. And what we tried to do is achieve a representative sample size of all these different sagebrush densities. So after this random stratification of our study area, we selected sites both within sagebrush critical habitat and the buffer area, and then at each site we completed a point count survey. So these were 5-minute, 100-meter radius counts, which means that for 5 minutes, we counted the total number of birds of each species within 100 meters of that observer. So in this example, you can see that an observer standing in the middle of the circle would have recorded 4 green birds and 1 purple bird. And throughout the study, in total, we completed 417 of these point counts over the 2 years. So for analysis and reporting reasons, we classified each species as either a grassland specialist or a grassland generalist. And this classification was made largely based on indices of grassland habitat specialism that was calculated from a paper by Correll et al. In 2019. But we also factored in each species' dependence on native prairie at the same time. So this is a list of our target species, and we ended up with 4 grassland specialists and a handful more grassland generalists. And this table shows the frequency of occurrence we observed for each species, both within sage-grouse critical habitat as well as the surrounding buffer, and then a combined category of the frequency occurrence throughout the entire study area. So we used a cutoff value of 10% as our sample size large enough to include species in our analysis. And as you can see, thick-billed longspur was only observed at 2% of our total point counts, and bobolink was observed at 6%. So unfortunately, we had to drop both species from our analysis. Even more disappointing is both are species at risk, and this information would have been quite valuable to obtain. However, this still left us with 4 other species at risk to evaluate. And not surprisingly, species at risk did dominate our grassland specialist category. However, lark bunting was one species at risk that was present in our grassland generalist category. So at each point count location, we measured the characteristics of vegetation at the site. We examined percentage of bare ground, cowpie, live grass, dead grass, and shrub cover, all within a 50 by 50 centimeter sampling frame. And this bare ground cover class also included spike moss, lichen, and other types of bare ground like rocks or gravel. And we later took the inverse of this bare ground category in order to provide an index of vegetation cover, which more accurately describes what we were trying to measure here. We also separated live grass into a percentage of native grass and exotic grass, and then compared the two to get a native grass ratio within the sampling plot. Originally, we had used 2 methods to measure shrub cover. The first was within the sampling frame, so similar to what I just kind of outlined. And then the second was a percentage of a 30-meter tape that intersected with shrubs along kind of its tract. But we found that the 2 were strongly correlated after the first field season, and that 30-meter tape method was extremely time-consuming. So we continued only with the 1 method in the second field season. And this was largely just so we could get to more sites and kind of cut down the amount of time that we spent doing our vegetation sampling. We also measured vegetation height and visual obstruction at the center of the sampling frame. And for those of you not too familiar with visual obstruction measurements, what this basically provides is an index of vertical vegetation density and its ability to conceal something like a bird or a nest in that grassland. So it's measured with a Robel pole that's marked with alternating colors every centimeter, and from 4 meters away, the observer will records the lowest centimeter mark they can see. So the pole is shown at the center of the sampling frame in the photo at the top of this slide, and at the bottom is somebody taking a measurement. Lastly, we also measured litter mass by collecting the dead, unattached plant material that was located within the sampling frame. We then completely dried out our litter samples in an oven before weighing them to get the most accurate measurement. So this slide shows how we set up our layout for our vegetation sampling. At the start of each field season, we set up a template just like this one by dividing our point count area into 4 quarters. And then for each quarter, we randomly selected an X and Y distance in meters, and this would be the location of our first vegetation plot. And then we randomly selected a compass bearing that would be the direction of our 30-meter transect. So here we'd set up a vegetation plot at the 0, 15, and 30-meter marks along that transect, and those are represented here by those black squares. And then when at the point count location, we'd randomly select 2 quarters to sample, giving us a total of 6 vegetation plots within that point count area. We used the same vegetation plot template for the entire field season, and this was simply just to speed up site selection during vegetation sampling, and that's the same reason why we randomly selected 2 quarters instead of sampling all 4. Again, just so we could get to more sites throughout the 2 years. So our first step of the analysis was to test whether the abundance of each songbird species differed within sage-grouse critical habitat in comparison to that surrounding buffer. So to do this, we used a generalized linear mixed model with pasture as a random effect. We found that the abundance of Sprague's pipit, Baird sparrow, and chestnut-collared longspur was all lower in sage-grouse critical habitat in comparison to that surrounding area. And species abundance, it ranged from 1.6 to 1.8 times greater outside of sage-grouse critical habitat. And then we found that the abundance of lark bunting, vesper sparrow, clay-colored sparrow, and brown-headed cowbird was greater within those sage-grouse critical habitat areas. So this ranged from 2.3 to 3.6 times greater, depending on the species. Also, there was no statistical difference in the abundance of savanna sparrow, grasshopper sparrow, western meadowlark, horned lark, and brewer sparrow between the 2 areas. Next, we want to examine how vegetation might be influencing songbird abundance. And to do this, we conducted a canonical correspondence analysis, or CCA. So this form of analysis extracts a series of gradients from your variables, and then you can plot where each of your sites exist along these gradients. So our data set was split into 10 gradients based on the analysis, and we've selected the top 2 gradients to plot on the figure shown here. So these top 2 gradients explain 72% of the variation explained by the CCA, whereas the remaining 8 gradients combined only accounted for 28%. Those remaining 8 gradients also contain a lot of overlap with these top 2 gradients, and were typically dominated by 1 or 2 single variables. So this provided further justification for us focusing primarily on these top 2 gradients. The end result is the figure that shown here that shows sage-grouse critical habitat sites in blue crosses and sites within the buffer area as those green triangles. So there is a bit of overlap between the 2, but you can see that sites within critical habitat tend to congregate near that bottom left corner of the plot, whereas sites kind of outside the critical habitat in that buffer area are clumped more in that top right corner. You may also notice that there's a lot more variation in the vegetation conditions within those critical habitat sites, as they're spread out over a much broader area than those buffer area sites. So what does this tell us about the specific vegetation characteristics of each site? Well, axis 1 in this case, or the horizontal axis, generally transitions from tall, dense vegetation to short, sparse vegetation as you move from left to right. And axis 2, which is the vertical axis, generally transitions from increased dead grass and % native grass cover to increased sagebrush and shrub cover as you move from top to bottom on the plot. And the arrows represent each of the vegetation variables we measured and show the strength of its association with each axis. So the length of the arrow typically tells you how important that variable was for the plot and the 2 gradients we measured. So the reason they tend to occur diagonally is because each variable is not exclusive to just a single axis, and in this case can influence both of those gradients at the same time. However, if one arrow kind of leans more towards one axis versus the other, it shows that it has kind of a stronger association with that gradient. So the circles shown here represent core areas of sage-grouse critical habitat, as well as the surrounding buffer area, and both with 95% confidence limits. The bottom left circle is sage-grouse critical habitat, and as you can see by the arrows, it was defined largely by areas with greater coverage of shrubs and sagebrush. The top right circle is the surrounding buffer area, and this area was dominated primarily by a high proportion of native grasses, as well as very few shrubs. And as you can see, both are mutually exclusive from one another and don't overlap. So this suggests that vegetation conditions within each area were quite distinct. So now I've added the codes for each of the songbird species, just so you can see which parts of the graph they're most strongly associated with. And just to give you an idea in reference to those vegetation gradients or those arrows. But if I zoom in a little bit and remove those vegetation arrows just to make it a little bit easier for you to see, you'll notice that each species has its own unique location along the gradients. So I'll go into a little bit more detail what each species code represents in the next few slides. But first, I'll add the 95% confidence intervals in, just so you can see, get a sense of the overlap and separation between each of the different songbirds. So if I bring up the pointer here quick and just highlight SAVs, or which in this case stands for savanna sparrow, and GRSP, which stands for grasshopper sparrow, you can see there's a lot of overlap in the confidence limits of the two species. So this would suggest that savanna sparrow and grasshopper sparrow were using very similar sites throughout our study area. But on the other hand, you can see that a species like CCSP, which stands for clay-colored sparrow, and CCLO, which stands for chestnut-collared longspur, occur on very opposite ends of this habitat spectrum. So clay-colored sparrows and chestnut-collared longspurs were using very different habitat types throughout the study area. So now if I add back those circles that represent sage-grouse critical habitat and the buffer area, you can kind of see that there's a large cluster of species near that critical habitat circle, so down in the bottom left corner here. And this just means that a large number of species had strong associations with that sage-grouse critical habitat. And if you look in particularly one species like LARB, which stands for lark bunting, it kind of has confidence limits that are very closely overlapping with that circle of sage-grouse critical habitat. So this would suggest that lark bunting had a very distinct association with these critical habitat areas. So the species that had the strongest overlap with sage-grouse critical habitat included brewer's sparrow, lark bunting, vesper sparrow, and brown-headed cowbird. And all four species are known to have close ties to shrubs, with brewer's sparrow being particularly closely associated with sagebrush. So it's not surprising that all four species within this triangle, or within this green square here, were strongly associated with sage-grouse critical habitat, because again, shrubs were one of the primary characteristics that define those sites. So at the other end of the spectrum, and more strongly associated with sites outside of sage-grouse critical habitat, were Baird sparrow and Sprague's pipit. So both species are known to be native grassland specialists, and during our study were found in areas with the greatest proportion of native grasses, as well as increased dead grass cover. And if you think back to the kind of the circles on the map, both species had very strong overlap between the types of sites that they occupied. So two other species that occupied a very unique habitat type were horned lark and chestnut-collared longspur. So these sites contain sparse vegetative cover with decreased litter and visual obstruction, and were essentially characterized by areas with increased bare ground cover, lichen, and spike moss. So these conditions were not really indicative of either sage-grouse critical habitat or the surrounding area. They were kind of their own unique kind of subset, located kind of within both areas. Although chestnut-collared longspur was a species that had a very strong association with the proportion of native grassland, and therefore had closer ties to the surrounding buffer area, which is why you see it kind of a little bit closer up to this top left circle than you would for a species like horned lark. And this also likely explains why chestnut-collared longspur abundance was lower within that sage-grouse critical habitat area in comparison to the surrounding buffer. And as I mentioned earlier, we didn't have enough sites to include thick-billed longspur in our analysis and make any defendable conclusions. But just for curiosity's sake, we did play around and add it into the analysis. And we found that it used sites very similar to what chestnut-collared longspur and horned lark were using. And this is not surprising, just based on what's known about thick-billed longspurs. So in fact, thick-billed longspurs occurred on the gradient kind of even more on the extreme end, and with even greater bare ground cover, spike moss, and lichen cover. So even more kind of in the far corner of this green square here. Now the remainder of the species included grasshopper sparrow, savanna sparrow, western meadowlark, and clay-colored sparrow. So these were species very representative of a grassland generalist classification, and they occupied sites kind of in the middle of the gradient between both those sage-grouse critical habitat areas and the surrounding buffer. And these sites typically had increased vegetative cover, litter, and increased visual obstruction. So because they kind of occurred in the middle, in no man's land between the two circles, that means that they weren't particularly associated with one region or the other, and kind of occurred equally as frequently in both. Now, clay-colored sparrow is one species that was strongly associated with shrubs, but less so with conditions that distinctly defined sage-grouse critical habitat. So instead of being associated with shrub species like sagebrush, they were more likely to be found in areas with shrubs like snowberry and intermixed with tall, thick grassland understories. So those weren't really too characteristic of sage-grouse critical habitat. And that's why you don't see as much overlap between the CCSP here and those critical habitat areas in the circle here. And then for those of you interested where bobolink factored into our analysis, it occupied its own distinct area, kind of up here in the top left corner. So these sites contain the greatest vegetation and dead grass cover that we observed within our study area. And although we had a very small sample size, this is quite consistent with what other people have found as far as habitat requirements for bobolink. So to summarize our results, we found that the conservation of sage-grouse critical habitat is likely to have minimal benefits to grassland specialists like Sprague's pipit, Baird sparrow, and chestnut-collared longspur. However, all three species did occur in sage-grouse critical habitat, but they occurred in greater abundance and were more strongly associated with vegetation conditions that characterize the surrounding area and that surrounding buffer. So one unexpected finding that we did notice was that the percentage of native grass was a key component for differentiating sites between both sage-grouse critical habitat and the surrounding buffer area. So we found that sites in both areas typically had a live grass cover that was greater than 60% native grasses, but those buffer areas were more consistently within the greater than 90% range. So this means that management of exotic grass species and conversion of tame pastures back to native within sage-grouse critical habitat could be one way of increasing the suitability of these areas for grassland specialists. And this would likely only have minimal or perhaps even no negative impacts on sage-grouse at the same time. So we did find that sage-grouse may serve as a valuable umbrella species for some of those shrub-tolerant songbirds. And one highlight is the importance of these areas for lark bunting, which, as I mentioned, is also a species at risk. And conservation of sage-grouse critical habitat is also likely to have neutral or positive effects on grassland generalist songbirds. So this means that many of these grassland generalists, like western meadowlark or savanna sparrow, could in fact be covered at least partially by the sage-grouse umbrella. It's also important to note that these findings are only applicable to sage-grouse critical habitat in its current state at the moment. So the effect of any management undertaken to either increase sagebrush or possibly modify grazing regimes to sort of bolster sage-grouse numbers would need to be studied further in order to see whether these effects would be positive, neutral, or negative on some of these other grassland songbird species. So we feel our results also provide an excellent opportunity to explore a multiple umbrella species approach. And going back to this figure, you can see that management directed towards 2 or 3 of these species could hypothetically provide suitable habitat for nearly the entire grassland bird community. And our results provided some confirmation of this at the same time. So we found that management directed separately towards Sprague's pipit, chestnut-collared longspur, and greater sage-grouse possibly could provide benefits to all of the species that require tall, dense native grasslands, as well as those short, sparse grasslands, and then also sagebrush habitats. So this would also benefit a lot of the grassland generalist species that occupy one or more of these different habitat types. And the reason why we selected Sprague's pipit over Baird sparrow was simply because pipits are classified as threatened as opposed to special concern like Baird sparrow. And also pipits are more strongly tied to native grass prairie and require larger grassland parcels. So that would suggest that they're perhaps a little bit more sensitive and maybe a better umbrella species candidate. And also the multiple umbrella species approach could also be extended over a broader region, just so that opposing management strategies don't overlap one another in sort of a smaller, finer landscape. And as I showed in our study area map earlier, sage-grouse critical habitat in Canada is largely made up of some small areas in southwestern Saskatchewan, as well as a very small portion of southeastern Alberta. Whereas, as you can see on the slide here, the distribution of chestnut-collared longspur and Sprague's pipit extend over much broader areas. So this might give you a lot more room to play with if you were sort of planning management around these two species. And this means that management directed towards Sprague's pipit and chestnut-collared longspur could be focused on some other core parts of the range so as not to compete with sage-grouse conservation. And lastly, work like this would not be possible without a long list of individuals and organizations. So we'd like to thank all the committee members and those who provided statistical and GIS support to improve not only the project, but also the manuscript. We'd also like to thank the two anonymous reviewers and editorial staff of the Wildlife Society Bulletin for all the suggestions and hard work they put in. And again, if you're interested in finding out more about the research, make sure to look out for the publication coming out later this year. We'd also like to acknowledge all the hardworking field crew members that helped collect the data, the pasture managers and private landowners who allowed access to their properties, as well as all the fine work that they put in to maintain this habitat and promote species at risk on their lands. And also acknowledge Grasslands National Park and the Nature Conservancy of Canada for providing access to their sites as well. And especially to all these wonderful organizations who provided funding support. So the project definitely couldn't have been conducted without them. And lastly, before I take any questions, I'd just like to throw in a little shameless plug about my current work at the Alberta Conservation Association on the Multisar program. So Multisar is a voluntary program that works with ranchers in southern Alberta. And what it does is try to promote species at risk habitat on their properties. So we conduct detailed assessments to try and identify what wildlife species or species at risk occur on the properties. And we also provide funding opportunities for range enhancement projects like water developments or wildlife-friendly fencing. And these projects always have kind of a mutual benefit to both species at risk as well as ranching operations. So if you're interested in species at risk conservation on your land, or perhaps if you're a rancher in southern Alberta who is potentially interested in finding out more or possibly participating in the Multisar program, definitely feel free to get in touch with me. My email is just at the top of the slide there. And thanks again to everyone for tuning in, and I'll turn things back over to Caitlin now if she's ready.
Yes, thank you so much for the awesome presentation. It was really good. And I always love that picture at the end there, the Multisar one. It's just so powerful and really well done. But yeah, thank you so much for really the fantastic presentation today. You're so clear and articulate. We do have a couple questions from our listeners today. The first one is from a listener named Tawny, and this person's wondering, what are the top 2 gradients for the CCA analysis?
So it's probably easier if I just go back on my slide here. So the top 2 gradients, they were the ones, so axis 1 had the tall, dense vegetation kind of on one end of it and the short, sparse vegetation on the other. So you can see that visual obstruction and vegetative cover sort of made up that tall, dense portion of the gradient. Whereas native grassland, and there isn't really any variable, but if you look at the opposite of vegetation cover, that would be lots of bare ground areas and club moss and lichen. So that was that first gradient of the top 2. And then the second gradient sort of transitioned from that increased dead grass. You can see that's an important factor for that gradient. And then you had more kind of just herbaceous vegetative cover. And then as you move down it, you got more shrub cover and sagebrush cover. So that primarily characterized those 2 top gradients.
Perfect. Thanks for that answer. Based on your research in the last couple of years you spent studying sage-grouse and grassland songbirds, what do you think is the best thing that Canadians can do for sage-grouse?
So that's a bit tricky because I don't want to pretend to be a sage-grouse expert here. A lot of my focus was actually on the grassland songbirds and mostly just looking at their habitat selection within sage-grouse critical habitat. But there are a multitude of different factors that would benefit sage-grouse. So we have lost a lot of grassland kind of in a lot of areas across the prairie. So that's another big thing is, just sage-grouse not having as much habitat as they originally did. And then once you start to concentrate sage-grouse into smaller and smaller areas, some of the other threats to sage-grouse become more and more concentrated as well. So like like harsh storms, and like hailstorms or bad weather. If a storm system comes through and all your sage-grouse are concentrated in one area, it has a larger impact. Or if things like West Nile come through, if all your species are concentrated, it also has a bigger impact. Another thing is just the amount of linear development and possibly perch sites in these areas. So they provide human developments in these perch sites provide advantages for predators, which could have a negative effect on sage-grouse. But again, I don't think there's just one simple solution for fixing sage-grouse. There's a lot of different factors that play in that. And again, take that with a grain of salt because again, I'm definitely not a sage-grouse expert.
No problem. Thanks for your answer. One of our listeners is wondering if there'll be more work going forward in this area, kind of like what you're talking about, the multiple um, umbrella species approach. Is there anyone else studying this since you've finished your master's?
So I think it plays into a lot of conservation, kind of in all areas. It might not be called the umbrella species concept, but indirectly it creeps into a lot of different types of management. One other thing I kind of mentioned at the start about that landscape level conservation, so that's becoming more and more prevalent. So I know like Environment and Climate Change Canada is focusing a lot of their efforts now on some priority places versus just single species management. So that's kind of a deviation from the umbrella species concept, but I think you'll always have, especially in Canada here, you're always going to have those species at risk that are going to require a little bit more attention than some of the other species. So you're always going to be looking at how does this management affect other species. So I think it'll be quite relevant whether or not people are directly calling it the umbrella species concept or not.
Awesome. Thanks for that answer. That seems to be all the questions that we have at the moment for our listeners. To all of our listeners out there, if you have any questions, feel free to type it into the question section of the webinar dashboard or send it by chat to the organizer. There is a comment that popped up here, Phil. One of our listeners, Myra, says, we live on an average, an acreage, I think, in the Capel Valley on a quarter of land. What can we do to help songbirds at risk? Only about an acre is devoted to buildings. The rest is native prairie grass.
Yeah, so on an acreage, it's kind of a smaller property, so you don't want to really overthink it and try and manage for every single grassland songbird at the same time, because ultimately you'll be trying to create so many different conditions on such a small area. So I think just maintaining your grass probably in kind of a moderate state would kind of give you the most bang for your buck likely and kind of benefit the most species at the same time. But again, just the biggest thing is that you have the grassland on your property and you're providing some protection for it. And then also make sure like it's not continually being overgrazed or anything like that, which I'm sure you're doing an awesome job and that's not the case anyway. So yeah. And if you
Awesome.
want any
That's
more
great.
information, feel free to email me and I can probably provide some more specific stuff about what each particular grassland songbird prefers.
That's great advice, and I would like to recommend our listeners check out the PCAP website too. We also have optimal habitat guidelines for species at risk, like Baird sparrows and chestnut-collared longspurs too, and some of those beautiful diagrams that you showed. We also have some diagrams like that available for landowners in Saskatchewan. So there's lots of resources out there too. One of our listeners is wondering how important is fire for these species? Is that anything that you've looked at?
So nothing that I've looked at. I know it is kind of a big focus of certain research projects, and fire definitely played its role. It was one of the major forces in shaping our grassland areas. So it plays a huge role. You can replace some of that aspects of fire with grazing, but again, you're not going to totally get the same effects. So I think people are just starting to look into a little bit more of you know, how does fire influence certain things that grazing can't influence, and possibly, you know, how do you add it back to the landscape? But it's a very tricky thing because not a lot of people, even control burns, not a lot of people want those on their property or even near their property just because of the risk factor. But
Mhm.
yeah, there's a whole new element that we probably don't even like fully understand yet, and that's just the impact of fire. So I mentioned grazing and moisture as being two of the primary forces for shaping vegetation structure. I'd say fire is right up there with those two, and those would be the main three.
Thanks for that answer. A listener named Paul is wondering if your results would change if you looked at relationships using critical sage-grouse brood rearing as opposed to overall sage-grouse critical habitat. Sorry,
Yeah,
brood rearing habitat.
I think it definitely would. So this was again just a very coarse map of sage-grouse critical habitat and sort of lumped everything together. Whereas if you looked at possibly some telemetry data that kind of separated out, you know, where sage-grouse spending more time throughout that critical habitat and compare the use in different seasons, you would see a difference, and maybe you would see that those areas were more important to some of these native grass specialists. But again, we found that even some of the more open patches that would probably be used for brood rearing did still contain, you know, moderate or low densities of sagebrush, and perhaps even these low densities of sagebrush might be too much for some of these species.
Interesting. Do you have any plans for a PhD?
Not at the moment. I'm just happy to finally be done school and collect my paycheck. So,
I bet. A listener named Joshua is wondering, he says, I know your research focused on songbirds, but did you have any incidental data on other species like burrowing owls?
no, actually we didn't. And burrowing owls didn't. We only had like a couple sightings of burrowing owls, so you can't really link that back to anything else. So that would be um kind of its own project, likely, is to see how does sage-grouse conservation influence burrowing owls, and could those two be feasible in the same area, or would you have to look at separate areas? And
Mm,
then also like a lot of the incidental observations of snakes and that too. We just didn't get a whole lot of them. So for all those other species, I think you'd almost have to do a more targeted approach for those.
yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. Um, One of the last questions we have here is from Mark, and he's wondering if the Winnipeg Jets actually play hockey. Do you have any comments?
Well, I know which Mark that is. That would be Mark Griffin. And I guess we'll find out in the playoffs when the Leafs choke, and we'll see how far the Jets.
Okay, I'm not a hockey fan, but sounds like you guys have quite the competition going on.
We do. I'm not overly confident at the moment with how my team is playing anyway. So
Okay. Um, well, we have lots of comments coming in from all of our listeners about just thank you for the presentation and how great of a presentation it was. So I think we'll leave it there. And I just want to reiterate the comments from our listeners. So thank you again so much for taking the time to share your master's research with us and go through all the details. So thank you so much, Phil.
great. Yeah. And thank you so much for having me, Caitlin. And thanks again, everyone, for tuning in.
Yes, thank you everyone for catching our presentation today, and be sure to check out our next one in June about bats. So hopefully we'll see everyone then. And yeah, everyone's saying congratulations, Phil, on completing your master's. Good luck with your conservation efforts moving forward. So, and somebody was just wondering if you could put up your contact information again, maybe that last slide.
Oh, sorry. Yep, I definitely will.
Perfect.
Oh, I think I went too far now. Um,
Oh, I think it's
but,
right there at the top.
oh, is it there? Okay.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
lost sight of it, but
perfect.
hopefully everyone else can see it.
Awesome. And this is being recorded, so we will put it up on the YouTube channel in the near future. And when everyone leaves this webinar, there will be a quick 1-minute survey if you don't mind filling it out. That'll help us keep our funding so we can keep our speaker series going into the future. So with that, thank you so much, everyone, and have a great rest of your day.